Hi there, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us for today's APMG webinar, which we're delivering in partnership with SPOCE Project Management and Nicola Busby Associates. It's Mark Constable here. I'll be your host and moderator, and I'm joined by guest presenter Nicola Busby. Nicola is an experienced practitioner, author, trainer and consultant in all things change management, and is also the lead trainer for APMG's change management course and certification at SPOCE. So you're certainly in good hands for this session. And in addition to that, Nicola runs her own consultancy business, consultancy and training, Nicola Busby Associates. So today's session is about how change management is crucial to ensure an overall and lasting success of projects and other change initiatives, because I think there's plenty of cases out there where projects deemed to have been closed, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's successful. So before I hand you over to Nicola, bear with me while I cover a bit of housekeeping. First point is we are recording the session, and everyone that's registered will receive a follow-up email from us soon after the recording's online. Secondly, questions. You can raise questions at any point during the session. You should see an option on your control panel, so do feel free to send those in. I'll be keeping an eye on them as we go through the session, and we'll try and address as many as we can towards the end. A couple of things that aren't on that slot on the slide there, but worth mentioning, we've got a couple of polls, 2 or 3 polls, I think a couple were early in the session and one further on, so do look out for those. We'll warn you when they're coming up. And we've got a couple of details of a couple of special offers as well, which I'll go through towards the end. And last but not least, feedback is very valuable to us, so when it comes to planning and delivering webinars in the future, all feedback is very much useful. Okay, that's all from me at this stage. So welcome, Nicola, and over to you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Mark. Welcome, everybody. Thanks very much for joining us this lunchtime. That's me. Mark's already introduced me, so we will whiz on. And the first thing then is a poll, just to make sure everybody's listening and engaged. So think back to the start of this year, January 2019. How many of you made a New Year's resolution or more than one resolution? That's the first poll question. And I think the poll's coming up, and you can click yes or no as to whether you made one or more New Year's resolutions at the beginning of this year.
Yeah, thanks, Nicola. That poll's live now, so I think you want to hold the results, don't you, until a bit later on? So I'll make a note.
So that's just the first question on that.
Okay. Okay, I think we'll leave it there. That's most votes for that one.
Most votes, excellent. Okay, and then number 2 is today, the 2nd of October. How many people, hand on heart and very, very honestly, are still sticking to those New Year's resolutions? So yes, if you are sticking to your New Year's resolutions, and no, if you're not.
Right, just wait a little bit extra. 55% voted. Okay, let's leave that there.
Okay, excellent. Thanks, Mark. Okay, so we'll come back to that a little bit later on. So what are we covering today? Well, as Mark said, we're talking about embedding as the final stage in a successful project. So we're going to look at 3 things. The first of all is sort of the difference between the project and the change success. The second is the role of inertia in embedding change, and that's our sort of really big issue that we'll discuss later. And then the last is some ideas that you can put in place to help embed your changes. So let's have a look at the first one, which is the difference between project and change success. So why are we looking at this topic? Well, I do a lot of training, change management, and I also do a lot of work with organisations in change management. And this really resonates with people. People often find that, even if you run your project really, really well and you implement it really, really well, there's an issue when it comes to embedding. And often that is because the project closes before all of the new behaviours and all the new ways of working are embedded, which means basically that you don't get your benefits because people will go back to old ways of working. So there's a saying by John Cotter, one of my favourite sayings in change, which is don't declare victory too early. And this is really one of the issues I think we see, is that we think that because we've embedded our projects, because we've implemented our projects and we've done a little bit of hypercare or a few weeks of checking everything's okay before we officially close everything that we've successfully got our change in. But it takes months, if not years, after the change is implemented to make sure that it's embedded properly. So I've got a picture up here of a Chinese dragon, and the reason for that is because there are actually lots and lots of conversations about this going on, and lots of people have come up with best practice and theories, and the scope of project management is widening, I know, to embrace this particular issue. But to me, change management is very much like one of these Chinese dragons. It's got quite a small head of sort of best practice and new ideas. And then the majority of organizations are sort of somewhere in the tail. So not everybody is able to really keep up and implement all of these best practices and things. So what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about theories and a little bit about the theory behind this and why this is a particular problem. But then we will be looking at some very practical things you can put in place to try and help embed your projects and get people working well so you can get your benefits. So what is still happening then? Why is this a problem? Why do we sort of tend to keep move away from our projects before we've embedded them fully? And I think these two diagrams to me are the best illustration of that, which is that on the side, the nighttime side there, on the left hand of my screen, you can see a ship that's been built. Now it can be a perfect ship, it can be the best idea, the best working ship with the most innovative and up-to-date technologies in it, or most streamlined, but until people are happy to use it, know how to use it, and are willing to embrace it and use it, the benefits of it will never be realized. And I think that's a problem that I see a lot. Is that the projects in organizations go as far as building the ship, maybe training people in how to use it, but not actually getting that real buy-in and really getting people engaged and wanting to use it. And as I say, theory is trying to embrace this, and I know the APMG, the new APM body of knowledge, has got a much wider scope around project managers, and that's great. But if you try to widen your projects too far into this field here, we end up with what I call the project change paradox. So this is your next poll here, and this is a scenario I'm just going to talk you through, and then we're going to ask you a question. So one of the ways of getting over this, the difference between a project which is about building things and change, which is about making sure people are happy to use it and embedding it, you have this business change project manager role, which seems to be becoming quite popular at the moment. And the idea of that is you are a project manager, but you're a project manager for a change which has a high impact on people, and therefore you have to do all of the business, all of the people side, the stakeholder engagement, the buy-in, all of those things, as well as the project. So at the moment, we're all business change project managers for a particular change, and we are at our go no go project board meeting. So basically that means that we've built a thing, or part of a thing if you're working in a more agile way, and we have to decide whether to go live with that. So the bit we were going live with is a new IT system that people need to adopt for the change to be successful. We've run a little pilot, with a few people, and it shows that the system is usable, but there's lots of bugs, which means that there's quite a lot of workarounds needed for the system to be used. And this hasn't proved popular with the pilot users. And so you've done some research and you've realised that fixing the bugs is going to mean delays to the rollout, which is going to send projects over time and budget, and it's going to be a major disruption for the organisation. This is because there's other changes that are relying on your change, and it would mean a major rearrangement of your programs portfolios if you delayed. So, do you recommend at that meeting that you go with your system with lots of bugs in it, or you don't go and you take the time to fix the bugs so your users are happier? So that's your challenge. Do you recommend go or no go?
Yep,
and I think on.
Yep, it's on, as most people voted. So
should we have a look at that then?
Yep, so 71% no go.
Really? That's good. Possibly because we're a change management presentation rather than a project management presentation, and I'm really, really glad about that, because obviously if you go, your risk is that your users won't be happy with the system and therefore they won't use it, and therefore your project may be successful because you've implemented your system and you may have changed people, but they wouldn't use it and therefore you wouldn't get the benefits. This was something that actually I had to deal with in a previous work situation where I was actually a business change manager. And I'm very passionate about business change, and on paper, I can see that the right answer is the one I think that 71% of you also chose. But interestingly enough, looking back now, I actually didn't recommend no go. I recommended go. And the reason that I recommended go is because I was completely compromised. I was conflicted in myself between what I was being rewarded for. And as a project manager, my job was actually to implement this particular system so that people could get on with the next set of changes and we could carry on with the program. That was actually my job. But as the business change manager, my job was to ensure that whatever was rolled out by the project was used by the people involved, and therefore the benefits were realised. But as the business change project manager, I found myself very, very conflicted, and the way that the pressure and the sort of the strength of feeling in the organisation and amongst the programme board and the project board was that I actually felt that I had to go with that first decision, that first recommendation to go. And actually what happened was that we did go, and we put in a lot of effort to get people to use the system, and everyone gave it a go actually. And the first few weeks everything seemed to be going okay, and people were working the system and they knew there were workarounds, but they were giving it a go. But then gradually over a course of months, usage went down, and so about 3 or 4 months later we were finding that people had gone back to the old ways of working, and we had to put in a whole new piece of work. It was a project, but it was very much business change in getting people to use the system and also to actually mend the system. So I just wanted to kind of share that one with you because that still interests me that that happened, and also it really does to me illustrate the value that change management adds in these projects and these programs still. So it's a very simple diagram, but anyone who knows me will recognize this diagram because I talk about this diagram a lot. And in projects, in a very simple view, there are three things that need to happen. The first is that you have to produce something that's going to change. And this can be tangible, it can be an IT system, it can be a building, it can be a new target operating model, but that actually needs to be kind of decided and built. Or it can be more intangible, it can be a change in culture or something like that. Alongside that, there's the associated activities. So these are the processes, the new ways of working that go alongside that. And then at the top, the third circle, the shaded one, you've got the people involved in and affected by the change. Because you can have, as I've said before, the best idea, you can sort out all your processes, but if people aren't willing to give it a go, or not willing to give it a go in the long term, or give it a go and decide that it's not for them, then you'll never get your change, your projects being used in the right way, the outputs of your projects, and therefore you won't embed the change and get your benefits. So to me, that is really where the unique value of change management is added, is in that top circle there. And so project managers seem to be rewarded for the bottom two circles, whereas change managers really are rewarded for adding that value of the top circle to ensure that change is used and therefore benefits are realized. And that was the conundrum that I had. And actually, if you see that there's more weighting in those bottom two circles. So I could have said go live because I've completed 1 and 2. I've completed the first 2 circles. And it's the third circle that still needs some work, but the 2 may have outweighed that. And so to me, even though we're talking about the scope of this project management widening, we've got portfolio management and program management, and should project managers have change management skills and all of those sort of good conversations that are going on. I think that whatever happens, we need to make sure that we still have independent representation by somebody in the projects or the programs who is purely looking at the people side of it, and that shaded in area there. Otherwise, I think that we really, it's one of the things that adds the problems to embedding these changes and really getting the benefits there. So just a bit of food for thought for you there. My first kind of challenge to you would be, in your projects or in your changes, do you have that representation? Do you have that independent voice there? Or are you expecting your project managers, your program managers, with their extended skill sets now in stakeholder management to play that role? And I think that the chances of embedding and success in terms of successful change are quite reduced if you don't have that independent voice. So it's food for thought. I'd be very happy to discuss this and get other people's views on this in the questions at the end. So that's the first section. The next section I just wanted to cover with you is about the role of inertia embedding change. So let's have a look at that. And this really comes about when, even if you really make the effort to change and you really want to do something differently, we often find that over time, there's this force of inertia that's pulling us back to old ways of working. So this is around behaviour changing, and changing behaviours is hard. So Mark, let's go back to that first poll that we did around the New Year's resolutions. Do you want to read out the results? So the first question was, how many of us made a New Year's resolution in 2019?
Sure. So we had 35% yes for making the resolutions, 65% no.
Okay, all right.
And the answers to whether they kept them, yeah, very similar.
Those still keeping it?
So very similar results, 35% yes, 65% no.
Excellent. My assumption is that that's 35% of the first 35% people who made the resolutions, if you see what I mean. So actually, if that's the way we've done it, so only 35% of the attendees should have voted for the second question. Does that make sense, Mark?
Yes, yeah,
Yes,
that's
excellent.
how I'd put it.
Excellent. So what we're seeing actually with that, thank you. And actually I am in there as well. I couldn't vote because I didn't have the voting buttons up. I did make a New Year's resolution and I am not still sticking to it. And I've been following my progress with this throughout the months, just to see what's happening to me. So this is around behaviour change. One of the things that around New Year's resolutions is we often make them because we want to do something differently, okay? But even when we want to do something differently, if we elect to undertake change ourselves, it's incredibly difficult to embed those changes to behaviours and routines. And one of those reasons is inertia pulls us back to the comfortable old ways of working. So my New Year's resolution was to not use takeaway cups. I was going to carry my cup around with me everywhere. And fill it up so I didn't have to use reusable cups. I'm sure I'm not the only one who had this as a New Year's resolution, and I'm sure more people are able to do this than me. But I really gave it a go for the first couple of months, really gave it a go. And then I found myself just going back to the old ways. So, you know, I wouldn't leave enough time in the morning to put it in my bag. Stupid excuses, I know. Or, you know, I didn't have enough room in my bag to put it, so I decided I'd you know, just leave it once, just this once. And before I knew it, quite frankly, by about March, I was back into my old behaviours. And this is an example of inertia. Even if we make an effort to change, inertia pulls us back to the comfortable old ways of working. So what does this mean? This means that changing behaviours, if we want to change our individual behaviours, it's not a one-off attempt or a short-term attempt to do something differently. A one-off attempt is easy. You know, we can all go out with a coffee cup once or twice. We can all go to the gym 3 times a week for 2 weeks. We can all eat healthily for a while, but it's that continual effort for a long time that makes it hard. But that's what we have to do before we can form new habits, before really, you know, our new ways of working, our new ways of behaving become embedded and are just our ordinary everyday life. And if you're interested in this, there is a really good book actually called The Power of Habit by someone called Duhigg in 2012. And that's, I think, published by Penguin, and that's really worth having a read. He talks about the process of putting habits in and how to help with behaviour change. So I would suggest having a read of that if you want to get some more thoughts, or any of you like me who didn't succeed in your New Year's resolution this year and want to have a go next year. So changing behaviours is hard for ourselves in our lives. Changing behaviours within organisations is even harder. There's a couple of reasons for that. The first is that there are extra challenges for individuals to make the effort to change in a work situation. So number one is not everyone will have chosen to do it. With our New Year's resolutions, they're individual. You set it yourself. Therefore, you've gone through a choice process and you are completely in control of whether you choose to have a New Year's resolution or not. And indeed, 65% of us chose not to this year. In a workplace, you don't have that choice. Somebody will have said you have to change, and you know, we can do things to help buy-in along the way, but still you won't have every individual who will have chosen to change. So that makes that effort harder for people. Another issue is it may not be top priority for everybody. So people may want to give it a go, but actually the effort to overcome that inertia may just become too hard. Learning to do things differently takes time. It could be that your priorities are in other places. So, you know, you slip back into the old ways because you're just not making it a priority. You may not actually personally benefit from the change. Again, with our New Year's resolutions, the idea of them is to benefit you in some way. I wanted to help with the saving the planet. You know, if you wanted to eat healthier or join the gym, that's about your own health. So New Year's resolutions, or when we choose to do a change, it tends to be because we will benefit from it. Organizational changes have benefits, but they don't necessarily benefit every single individual in the organization in every single way possible. So individuals may find that their jobs take longer, or they're not as happy in their jobs, or they've lost some power, or all sorts of reasons why people may not personally benefit from the change. And therefore, to make the effort to change habits is even harder. And then the last issue is the one that we were discussing in this section, really, is that the focus moves on to other priorities before behaviours are embedded. So this is the issue around the project. If my project personally was to ensure that I was going to take my cup with me everywhere I went in 2019, my project would have included researching good cups. I would have bought myself a cup to take with me, a good travel cup to take with me. I may have tried to find coffee shops that can give me discounts for using my cup. There's plenty of coffee shops that do that now. And my behaviour change would be around making sure that I always carry my cup with me, and I always use it. 2 weeks after go live, so second week of January, I will have carried my cup everywhere with me, and I could deem my project successful. And in an organisation where there's other priorities, there's lack of resources, things change very quickly, it is really, fairly reasonable decision to make at that point to say, great, that's been successful, let's close that and move on to our next issues. However, because behaviours take longer to embed and it's sustained effort over a long period of time, that's too quick to shut the project. You took your focus elsewhere, and then behaviours go back to old ways of working because of the inertia. And in organisational terms, this is something that Lewin, a long time ago now, in 1951, recognised and explains with his forces and his force field analysis. So anyone who's done the change management course, foundation practitioner course, or you may have come across this in different guises. But what Lewin says is that an organisation is in equilibrium because they have opposing forces acting on the organisation. There's forces that want the organisation to change, and there's forces that want the organisation to stay the same. So forces for the change and resisting the change. If your organisation is kind of static in a stable state, that's because the forces are equal. So obviously, if you want to change your organisation, you have to increase your forces to change. All right. So again, my New Year's resolution, I increased my forces to change because I made sure that I had a New Year's resolution to do that. I bought my cup. I did all of those things. Okay, that increased my forces to change. So therefore, the change should have happened. However, there's a concept called homeostasis that Lewin talks about, which is that there's a tendency for systems to maintain their current state. So what that means is that the forces, if you increase your forces to change, your forces resisting the change will also increase. So if you increase your forces to promote the change, there is a reaction from the changes on the other side that they increase because they want the system wants to maintain its equilibrium, its homeostasis. So it's not enough just to work on the forces acting for the change. You actually have to sort of work on the forces acting for the change, and then more and more work to overcome those resisting forces until you've embedded the change. And that takes a long time. It takes longer than the time that we often give ourselves for projects. So that's a little bit on inertia and homeostasis. So let's have a look now then at some ideas about what we can do in our change or our project situations to help that. So the first question that we need to ask ourselves is, how are we going to know? How are we going to know when the change is embedded? If it's not enough to say a couple of weeks after go live, if everyone's done their training, if everyone's displaying the right behaviours for a couple of weeks or a month, that's not long enough to embed it because inertia may pull us back over the longer period of time. When are we going to know? When is that change time going to be that our new ways of working become embedded and pretty much our business as usual, so we can be in equilibrium with our new ways of working? Well, really, the only way to know is to gather evidence, to measure it. And so we need to somehow come up with some measurements to gather evidence that the change is embedded. And this is harder than it first seems. And it could be using a number of measurements depending on the type of change that you've got. So the first thing you can do is you can do the work to see whether you've got your benefits. Have your benefits been realised? There's a number of issues with benefits realisation. The main, or a big one, being that a lot of organisations are not very good at measuring their benefits realisation or actually realising benefits at all. But if you are measuring your benefits, you need to have to think about, well, how do we measure those? It's very easy to know when your quantitative measurements, quantitative benefits are realised. So, for example, quantitative means anything you can put a number on. So, if your change is being done to reduce costs, for example, then you will know that your benefits are realised when your costs are reduced. Or if it is to reduce headcount, you'll know that your benefits have been realised when your headcount is reduced. However, what happens with a lot of changes now are more complex than that, and a lot of the benefits that are being tried to be realised from projects are a lot more what we call qualitative, which is a lot more around behaviours, enablers, soft benefits. So, for example, if your project or your change is to increase a customer focus in your organisation, how are you going to measure that? Or if you want to move to a more risk-taking type of organisation, a more innovative organisation, how are you going to measure that? How are you going to know when your benefits are realised? So the first thing you need to do is have a think about that. There's various ways of doing that and other ways of measuring to know your change is embedded. And I've just put some suggestions here. Usage figures. So IT reports, how many people are logging in and using new bits of technology, for example. Usage figures, business intelligence figures on all sorts of other things can be helpful there. If you're trying to reduce the use of paper, for example, you can get figures from photocopiers on how many pieces of paper people are using and how much people are using the photocopiers. So lots of little things like that may build up to help you with your picture. The next thing you can do is self-reporting. So people, especially this is quite good around behavioural changes. So, how many times have people used new skills? If for example, you want people to have a more customer-focused approach in the organisation, how many times have they thought about customers at the heart of their decision making, for example? And you can actually ask people to self-report on those sorts of things. Observation is another way of doing this. If you want behavioural change, you can have things like 360-degree feedback on how people are behaving. You can do things like mystery shoppers. That doesn't have to be external into the organisation. You can go and sit in on meetings. You can listen into people's activities with their permission, obviously, to see whether behaviours are being embedded. Other things you can do is things like number of issue users and queries. So the less people are asking how to use things, you could maybe think that people are getting more and more used to using it, therefore your change is becoming embedded. And the other thing is feedback from change agents, for example. If people are talking more positively about the change, or they're talking about the benefits they're beginning to use from the change, if they're showing much more confidence in what they're doing over time, that can also be an indicator that your change is embedded. But there's no one way of doing it. So my suggestion would be to use a number of measurements to build the evidence. And agree targets before implementation. You rarely need 100% usage or 100% of satisfaction rates, for example, for things to be embedded. But take measurements over a period of time to counteract that inertia, as I said before. Don't just take the measurements for 2 weeks or a month and think that that's fine. It takes a lot longer than that for people to embed behaviours. The next thing to think about is who's going to oversee the embedding phase, because, as I say, projects often change before the changes, often end before the change is fully embedded. We do need to keep that investment. So, a couple of points here. Your change continues to need to be owned by a senior leader, and they need to be responsible for the success. So they need to be held to account if the change does not, if the benefits aren't realised, or people start going backwards and the change starts failing. Focus on people, not just practicalities. Often when projects close, you'll have people who continue to look at the practicalities. So you'll have somebody who's probably a product owner for the IT, or you'll have facilities who are looking at estates, for example. But you really need someone who's going to be focusing on those behaviour changes and making sure that people are embedding and continue to be working with the change. And embedding activities need to continue. So we need champion groups or super user groups to continue to support users, and also look at how to continually improve the change. When you go live with anything, it's never a sort of a stable state. It's never a fixed point when it's finished and completed. There's always new ideas, always new ways of using things. And this can go on for a long time and help to overcome that inertia. Your line managers, they need to help to embed those behavioural changes in their teams. Monitoring and measurement needs to continue. And then any remedial action is needed to prevent slipping back into old ways if this begins to happen. And all of this takes investment, time, resource, concentration, senior management involvement, and all of this needs to be built into the project before go live, really, to ensure that this is continues after implementation. So let's just end by looking at a few things that we can possibly do to help and put in place for that embedding. The first is to have a quick look at if your change is, if you've implemented successfully, and then over the next few time periods your change isn't embedding, then there has to be something wrong. So you can do some various analysis to see where the problem lies, and you can call this root cause analysis or the 5 whys, or looking at vicious circles. But there's a diagram here that kind of explains that a little bit more. So this is this is from the change management course, practitioner course, this diagram. But okay, we've got just a typical change here with a new system. Doesn't really matter what the system is, but this is what can happen, which means that the change doesn't embed. So line managers don't like the system, staff look to line managers for direction, team members don't adopt the change because their line managers aren't, team members work around the system with no negative consequences. In time, everyone forgets how to use the system, and a few months down the time, what system are we talking about? And so this is an embedding issue. And how do we overcome that? Well, you can have a look here and say, well, which of these activities are broken? Which of these are causing the problem? And therefore, how you might you mend them? And looking here, there's 2 places, I think, that you could do something to mend this. The first is the number 1 activity, which is the line managers don't like the system. Okay, there is some activity that needs to be done there to improve acceptance by the line managers, because if the line managers like the system, the staff will look to the line managers for direction, and if the line managers are adopting the system, then the team members will. So that will mend that broken bit there of the system. And then the second one is where number 4 is, which is team members work around the system with no negative consequences. If that could be mended in some way, that there are, you can look and try and get rid of these workarounds so that people actually are encouraged to use the system more. Again, that will maybe mend that bit of the circle. So you can do a bit of analysis to see what can help with there, what things you can help with there. Something else you can do is when you are designing your training or your learning interventions, you can have a think about how you are actually going to train, or what learning interventions you're going to use, and how you're going to evaluate them. How are you going to actually check that the training has been successful? And when we learn something new, which we do in change, there's three things that we learn. There's knowledge, so we have to have a practical understanding or a theoretical understanding of the subject. We have to learn skills, so we have to become proficient in new ways of working, new ways of behaving. But the last thing is we have to have the right attitudes or behaviours. And this is the mental and emotional stance towards a subject. And this links back to the shaded in circle in the three parts of the project that we discussed earlier in the webinar around the product, the processes, and then the people bit. We really need to make sure that everyone has the right attitudes and the right behaviours towards the change. And people don't learn this through attending training sessions or sort of learning processes or reading. The best way to learn it is through role plays, observing models, through coaching, through mentoring, and it's best evaluated through consistent patterns of behaviour over time. And we often talk a lot about how line managers are very important in change, and this is one of the places where they really are important, because they're the only people really who can monitor and support their staff with the attitudes and the behaviours needed to embed that change and to really make the change happen. So make sure that when you're planning your training and your learning interventions, that you also plan in there that attitudinal training and learning, which will go on after go live, after your tangible thing has been implemented. The next thing you can do is you can disable old ways of working, okay? And there's something here, Lewin again, who we met earlier on, Cole Lewin. He's got an equation here, which basically says that behaviour, an individual's behaviour, is a culmination of a person and their environment. So our individual behaviours are really dictated to by two things. One is ourselves, our paradigms, our experiences, our values, the way we see the world, all of those sorts of things, but also the environment that we find ourselves in. And I like to think of this as the old saying, don't put the alcoholic back in the pub. And that basically means that you can take somebody and you can work on the person. You can work on behaviours and the way that you do things. But if you put people back in exactly the same situation, they will go back to their old ways of working. They will do old things. So to help with inertia, to help people sliding back into old ways of working, see if you can disable old ways of working. Can you get rid of old systems? Can you, if you're just sort of get rid of shelves if you want people to be paperless? Can you move offices around or have new branding or symbols to remind people that things are different to the way that they used to be? So that's one suggestion there, is to try and make things different, disable your old ways of working to help to counteract this inertia. The next is around leadership behaviours. There's ProSci, which is a big research organisation about change. Often they do a survey every couple of years, and often come up with the feedback that the greatest contributor to overall change management success is active and visible sponsorship. So getting our leaders to walk the talk, as we say, is a really key way of embedding change and stopping people sliding back into old ways of working. But remember, leaders aren't only found at the top of the organisation. Okay, this isn't something that the CEO has to do, or the executive board, or your project sponsor in isolation. Leaders are everywhere in organisations. They're you, they're change agents, they're line managers, they're people with the personal power that other people look up to. So really find some key people in your organisation and encourage them to be seen to be working in new ways, and that will help bring everybody else along and prevent the inertia, people sliding back to old ways of working. And then the last one is to make sure that you update formal controls and measurements. Organisations have a number of controls around them, including performance measures, objectives, job descriptions, policies, structures, reward systems. And you need to make sure that all of these are aligned with the way you want people to be behaving and working in the future. And so that people are encouraged and actually not punished inadvertently for behaving in their new ways. So, for example, if you're expecting people to put customer at the heart of their everything that they do, then you may need people to spend more time with their customers, talking to their customers. So don't penalise people for behaving differently, for allocating their time differently. You need to make sure that all of these are updated, but make sure that you do it after the change has been implemented, because you may find that there's different ways and different things that people need to do and different priorities. So make sure that you finalise it after you've got a real idea of how people are going to work, and then ensure that these support you. So that's a little bit of a thought from me. It's a huge subject, but hopefully there's some thoughts and some hints and tips that you can take back to your organisation. We've got some time for some questions. So I think Mark has been collecting some as we go. So I don't know if you've got any questions there, Mark, that we can have a think about now.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Nicola. And I love the quote. Don't put the alcoholic back in the pub. That's really resonates the point. I think really good. And I can imagine, and that final slide's really caught my attention as well, because I can imagine just how many changes go through, but then no one updates the info behind it and everything associated. So really good point. We've got a few questions so far. I think the first couple are more observations, but it's definitely worth highlighting. So Jane says this goes back to the situation at the start. Do you go or don't go? And Jane says she's been in a similar situation, but we agreed to throw a lot more post go live support to manage expectations. We had daily updates on workarounds and resolution dates. This ensured that stakeholders knew we had the system under control and they understood why we'd gone live.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, it was a simplistic. Anybody who works in projects and change, which you will do here, will know life is never as simple as that very simple scenario on there. So there are various ways of handling it. And Joe, yes, absolutely, that is another way of handling it. I think the key there, though, is to just recognise that there is as much importance that needs to be given to what happens afterwards with your users as just sort of building the systems. Yeah.
Great, and William makes a point about sort of conflict between the individual project and a wider portfolio. So just lost the detail for a second there. So yeah, even though the correct thing for the project might be to go or no go, it might not necessarily be the right thing for the portfolio.
Absolutely, and again, the solutions will depend on the various situations of your organisation. So maybe in that case, you would need the person leading the portfolio to be on that project board who can argue the other way. So I think what it is nothing is ever completely right or completely wrong. So it's always a case of weighing things up. And if you don't have that view from the people side and the person who's actually looking at it and saying, you know, if we do decide to behave in this way or that way, this will be the effect on the people. This will be what will happen, or this will be what will probably happen. And therefore we need to put something in place to stop that happening. Then the chances of embedding the project and getting the benefits and it being successful significantly reduce. And if you don't have those two things in there, that looking at what will happen if we don't implement the projects and we don't stick to our timelines and our costs, etc., versus what do we do if we don't get the buy-in and we don't get the people on board, then you don't have the information to make those difficult decisions.
Great, thanks, Nicola. And Cheryl asks, any advice for getting investment for continued embedding when senior managers don't recognise the need?
Well, hopefully some of the things we've talked about today would help. It's around education. It's around knowing, people knowing the risks of not investing in embedding. So you might want to have a look back in your organisation and see if there are any examples of cases where projects went live but you never really got the benefits. Most organisations can find some. So if you could find an example of that and use that as an example, then that would be useful. The other thing to do is to try and put it in resource and money terms. You know, how much is this project costing? How much are you investing in buying things or project managers or you know, time lost from the organisation by not doing something else? And that's your short-term costs of your project. But what are the ongoing costs of not getting the benefits of the project not embedding successfully? And often they will outweigh the short-term costs. So it's about education, it's about talking, it's about exploring those issues, really. The other thing I always think is a very, very strong argument is to not make these arguments yourself as somebody who's working on the projects, but get your users to make those arguments. So you know, if your users feel that they're not going to you know, they're not ready to go, or that they feel they need more work afterwards, then get them to make the case to your managers. And managers often listen a lot more to users than they do to people like project and change managers.
Cool, thanks, Nicola. Time for another 2 or 3, I think. So would you say in an organisational change, it is both a project manager as well as change manager that are required, or would you say that a change manager's role is by default expected of a project manager?
I think this comes back to the conversation around the business change project manager. Again, it depends. The risk, I think, of not having the change manager is that you don't have that sort of view that's purely looking at it from the people point of view. But it also depends on how big the impact of your change is on people. And the bigger the impact, the more people have to change their behaviours, the more they have to change their cultures and their ways of working, then the more you need a change manager. So I would say it's on a sliding scale. You don't need a change manager or a really invested you know, change manager full-time for changes that don't have a lot of impact on your end users or your organisation. But the bigger the impact, the more it's impacting behaviours and changes, the less popular the changes are, and the more complex the change for users, the more you need a change manager.
Great, thanks, Nicola. Martin's question here. I haven't heard the word quality used. On the basis that a project must be set up to succeed up front, do you agree there is an important role for project managers in promoting quality management and making quality a deliverable? Absolutely, completely agree. But my problem with quality, when I started my working life, I hadn't had any project management training, and I used to struggle with the word quality because I assumed that quality meant everything is perfect. Whereas actually, it took me a while to realise that quality just means an agreed quality. So it doesn't actually have to be perfect.
And again, I'm just wondering if there is a role for a change manager in there, and looking at the people side to agree what quality is. So going back to my example of the go and the no-go, technically the system had reached a level of quality, it worked, but there were so many workarounds for it, it hadn't reached an acceptable quality level for people to use it. So again, I think that their quality is inherent. I'm sorry I didn't pull it out, but that is another place where you need that separate people view to agree the quality of what you're going to be producing.
Cool. Thanks, Nicola. One final question from David. We have a hybrid job, and it's project manager with change in brackets, who lead change projects, but mainly have a project management background. Any top tips for helping these people to think about change management more?
Yes, I think that give them some change management training. And I do think that the change management qualification, which I know, Mark, you're going to talk about a little bit more in a little bit, is brilliant, because it really does give you some time to really understand the need for that that change piece in there. But I would say that there's some key things for that kind of role to understand. And the first is this piece around the impact. How much impact on people is your change going to have? And so impact assessments need to be done. I know not everybody does them, but even where they are done in projects, you have to make sure that you're looking at the impact on people, as well as the impact on systems, on hardware, on all of those sort of more tangible things as well. And then so you need to look at the impacts on behaviours, the impacts on cultures, the impact on leadership styles, the impact on decision making. And if your project is really going to be impactful on those areas, then that is really where your project manager who's working on that will either need additional change management support, or they need to somehow manage that tension between project delivery and buy-in for change.
Great, thanks, Nicola. I think we'll have to leave questions there, because we're very close to our hour, so I think we'll start to wrap up. Okay. First thing I'll cover is the couple of special offers that I mentioned at the start. So Nicola, if you could bring up the, we've got the first, haven't we? There it is.
No, sorry, that one.
Yeah, got it. So yeah, first special offer is on the screen there, or there it is. So this is the APMG Change Management course, and SPOCE are an accredited provider, and Nicola is the lead trainer for SPOCE. So there's details on there about an upcoming course in November in the UK, and there's a 20% discount of the course fee or free accommodation, and you can contact the team at SPOCE in order to claim that. And what I should say as well is just a reminder that we are sharing the slides after the webinar as well, so don't worry about furiously scribbling down the details. So that's special offer number one. Special offer number two is there for you. So this is Nicola's book, The Shape of Change, and Nicola's kindly arranged a discount code with the publishers. So similar to the last offer, it's a 20% offer, and you can order that from the publisher's website with that code that's on screen there. So yeah, again, we're sharing the slides, so you'll have the details soon via email. Okay, I think that's it. So yeah, we'll leave this final slide on the screen with just a few useful links there while we close, but just leaves me to thank everyone very much for attending. We do appreciate you taking time out of busy schedules to join us, and we do hope you found it useful and informative. And many thanks, of course, to you, Nicola, for joining us today and sharing your insights and expertise. Much appreciated. Okay. So thanks again, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your week, and we hope to see you on future webinars. Bye-bye.